Okay, joined now by Kurt Hyde. Kurt is an old friend of the show and really one of the foremost election engineering experts in the country. He has done a lifetime study of how elections work and also about how elections can be manipulated. Kurt, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, a lot of Americans have no idea about this. There's a lot of Americans who hear the word election fraud and they roll their eyes. That'll never happen here. Going back, almost to the founding of the country. Talk about what the history of election interference has been.
Well, actually, we've had some electoral problems right from the very start, every now and then. Even though when our country was first founded, there was a very, very much higher rate of morality and honesty and integrity. But even early on, there have been a few elections. But I think the first one that was a real scandal was the election in New York City of 1838. And then there was a follow-up scandal in 1839. And what happened is that one of the conspirators in this conspiracy was a man by the name of James Glentworth, and he wrote a book on it explaining how it was done, not as a how-to manual for others, but as a warning to other people of what to look for. It is interesting that many of the fraudulent people that they brought in to help commit these frauds came from Philadelphia, and they were already experienced at committing those frauds in the elections, even in 1838. Now, we've had other fraudulent elections. We had a really serious one in Kansas that led to a thing called Bleeding Kansas. It actually erupted into a precursor to the Civil War. Then we also had some really tremendous frauds in 1868, and they were investigated by the U.S. Congress. And I have a copy of the report that was published of it, and it was a well investigated fraud. There were other frauds too, such as 1908 in Chicago, and there was a grand jury investigation of that one. And there was a grand jury report, and I've quoted from that in some of the articles in the New American. There were other frauds, such as Louisville in 1905. That was a municipal election, Louisville, Kentucky. And then, of course, there was 1948 when there actually was a confession by Luis Salas, the election judge, saying that Lyndon Johnson did steal the Senate nomination from Governor Coke Stevenson. So we've really had them. In fact, one of the earliest committees formed when our first Congress met was the Committee on Elections. And unfortunately, it was disbanded in 1947. And that Committee on Elections had the responsibility to actually hear complaints about elections and make a report to the House to give their opinion on it. And I think that had the abolishing of that committee has done us a lot of harm.
The one elephant in the room that we didn't mention, you mentioned Johnson. The one that people think of about the only one they can remember is John F. Kennedy's election in 1960. Talk a little bit, if you can, about the what went on in Chicago that ultimately pushed John F. Kennedy to the White House.
Well, that was both Chicago and Texas. What happened was that Chicago and Texas had very narrow wins for Kennedy and Johnson. And they actually started a recount in Chicago, and there was a really good chance that the recount was going to come up with a different winner. But what it was is Richard Nixon quit early, and because Richard Nixon quit early, he wound up just conceding, and that's why it really didn't go too much further than that. It's funny that you brought that up, because not that many, I guess maybe some people are aware of it, maybe some are not, but Barry Goldwater had planned on using the 1960 election and the questions about it as part of his campaign in 1964. But unfortunately, the President Kennedy was assassinated and that kind of that changed everything.
And so here we are now, and you actually reached out to me because on a show you did about a month ago, I made the comment that we have, throughout our history, we really haven't relied that heavily on absentee ballots, and you gratefully you corrected me on that. Talk about the history of absentee ballots. How long have Americans been able to vote in alternative means from simply showing up to the polls?
I think around 1639. We go back a ways. But in 1639, there was this was in Newport, Rhode Island. That's the first I have found, and it's likely that was the first. After all, that was only about 19 years after the Pilgrims got here. So, and Rhode Island or Newport was a new colony at that point. But seriously, they started off initially where you could drop off a piece of paper with your choices on it, and you'd give it to one of the election officials. And within a very few years, they also formalized the process, and they also made sure that everything that was done very much in the open. They called it a proxy, and the original thing looked something like an absentee ballot. 3 New England states, Massachusetts and Connecticut, in addition to Rhode Island, and also 1 southern state, South Carolina, had some provisions for proxy voting. Now, it didn't take too long for the proxy voting to get away from the voter handing a proxy to somebody to then become a proxy, meaning the appointment of somebody who would vote for you. And because they did it this way, they maintained the integrity of the precinct. They maintained the integrity of the election day because let's say you and I lived in the same voting precinct. I could appoint you to be my proxy because I would trust you to vote the way I wanted you to, and I would sign an affidavit or something similar to an affidavit, and then you'd have to swear to it, but then they would allow you to vote twice, once for yourself and once for me. Notice, however, that we kept the precinct intact and we kept the election day intact.
Interesting stuff. I mean, really appreciate the history lesson. And that turns us to the question of the day, Kurt. There is all sorts of stuff that's been threatened. There's all sorts of stuff being planned. First question I want to ask you is about the modern election, the one we're about to have next week. The question I'm asking you is this. Why is it that states are deciding, in some cases with only 3 or 4 months before the election, that they're going to allow people to simply vote and count, to extend deadlines? Is this unprecedented? I don't remember any election where this close to the election, states were still deciding whether or not they were going to extend voting rules or how votes get delivered, whether signatures need to match. I mean, it's just amazing to me that within just a few months of the election, this is taking place here. Has that happened before?
Never that I've heard of in America. However, in dictatorships, this is how things are done, where the dictators in charge get to change the rules as the game is being played and with last minute, no notice changes and things like that. You find dictators doing that.
What do you think is the most egregious examples in the country right now? What are you expecting in terms of voter fraud? Who's most likely to engage in it, and how would it look?
Oh, boy. Quite a few questions in there. I guess the most egregious examples are when the courts are ordering people to go to mail-in balloting, because that is legislating from the bench, which is unconstitutional. Plus, it is a very unsafe method. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier, and that is that in the Civil War, when absentee voting did expand in this country, the only 2 forms that I've ever been able to find were either the appointment of proxies back in your home district or the soldiers who voted in the camps. It took until about shortly after 1900, maybe a little short of 1912, before Kansas started having anything that even looks the remotest like an absentee ballot. But going back to this thing, I am seeing things right now that make me highly suspicious, because one of the problems is that we're finding huge numbers of people who are showing up to vote in early voting, and I'm very nervous about early voting because I think it's a great opportunity for what's called a repeater. That's a repeater voting. that is where a person votes more than once. I vote once under my name, once under somebody else's name. Actually, a whole list of fictitious names. You don't even need to have people who've died or moved away. You can just make up John Jones and a fictitious address. And where we're seeing these large numbers of early votes, and also we're watching the vote harvesting going on. In fact, Project Veritas just yesterday showed some vote harvesting going on in the San Antonio area.
For those, a lot of people have heard that term, but for those who don't know exactly what it means to harvest a vote, fill us in.
Okay, well, vote harvesting, that's where somebody goes out and works with people who've received absentee ballots. They go to nursing homes. They go to people in their own homes. Sometimes they, like we've documented, there was at least one a letter carrier for the post office who was on the phone with the ballot harvester, letting her know when he was dropping off ballots, because absentee ballots are typically have a very distinctive envelope on them. So the ballot harvester is a person who goes out and tries to make sure people have voted. It's not so bad that they do that, but people should be voting on their own and of their own volition. I'd like to give you a couple more terms too.
Sure.
We know what, I think we understand what a ballot harvester is. Another one is we just used was the word repeater. That's a person who votes repeatedly. Now, these are the people who cheat during early voting. You know, in those in the congressional investigation of the election frauds of 1868 in New York City, they found at least one repeater who voted 40 times in that election in their investigation. So that's a repeater. Now, there's another one that you might not be aware of, and that's a hauler. The hauler is the name given to the people who are hauling people to the polls. Now, giving someone a ride to the polls is typically not illegal in any state. However, when you take the same people around all day to multitudes of different places to go voting, and then you yourself know that you are helping people to vote multiple times, that is also what the word hauler means.
It's very interesting. And, you know, well, a big concern is what's going to happen in this election. And the troubling thing is that if people are engaging in these kinds of ballot harvesting, repeating, hauling, and, you know, in the first night or two of the election, they call the election. Let's say they call the election for Joe Biden 2 days after the election's over, finally. And then it takes 6 months, maybe a year, to go back and look at these ballots. If you find 6 months later that an election was literally stolen, what can you do about it after the fact?
That is a very sad thing. And unfortunately, when people lose faith in the ballot box, that's when they reach for the bullet box. And there actually is, for the first time since Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, of having violence break out as people begin to doubt the results of an election.
Well,
that is scary.
It is discouraging. And so, again, we've got about a minute and a half left. Give us your scenario. You are one of the foremost experts on this kind of a thing. What do you see happening? What is your prediction for what's going to happen?
I'm predicting a lot of uncertainty, but very clearly, I'm seeing things like a possible violence. I'm seeing things like people now starting to bypass the local police and say, well, I guess we'll need to bring federal troops or we'll need to bring National Guard troops in. I am just seeing these large numbers of people voting. I'm seeing indications of ballot harvesting that, like Project Veritas has found. I myself am suspicious that there is repeater voting of people just using assumed names. And unless there is some mechanism for truly investigating and trying to get to the bottom of it, I think we might have there might be uncertainty about the outcome no matter who wins. That is totally frightening. For the last 34 years, I've been warning people that elections need to be accurate and honest, and provably accurate and honest. We not only need to have an accurate and honest election, we need to have confidence that that election result is truthful, or else, like I say, that's when people lose faith in the ballot box. That's when they reach for the bullet box. We don't want that here.
Kurt, we're so grateful for your expertise. This is a subject that far too Americans have not studied. You've been a great resource in the past. We'll talk to you again soon, I hope. Let's have you back on after the election, and let's dissect what we've seen.